Roob, I can't imagine how long it took you to do all these top 10 lists.
So I'm obsessed with lists, and I think people kind of have picked up on that. I have lists of, my 1,000 favorite concerts ever, my 500 favorite. Actually, it's being published. My 500 favorite Guided by Voices songs will be on Magnet Magazine's website later this month.
Really? That's awesome. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So I don't know. My mind just thinks maybe it's my track background. Everything's a list, but I just I love listing things. And I was at the beat, whatever they call the arena in Camden, BB&T, whatever it is now, to see War on Drugs, and I ran into the drummer from Dr. Dog, Eric Slick, who I knew, and his wife, Natalie Press, who's a really, really good songwriter and singer in her own right. And he introduced me to Natalie as, "Oh, this is Roob, that guy I was telling you about. He makes all the lists."
The list guy.
I'm the list guy. So, yeah. So it was kind of fun to do it, though.
Yeah, I like
some of them were kind of tricky and not super easy.
Yeah, I should mention that we're talking about top 10 Eagles lists that we're going to go through. We won't have time for the top 500 Guided by Voices songs.
Maybe I'll do my top 10 if we have time at the end.
Okay, we'll see if we have time for that. This is the Eagle Eye Podcast. I should mention that. He's Reuben Frank, the list guy. I'm Dave Zangaro, the non-list guy. But we're going to go through the list today. I had a lot of fun reading them. I hope you guys did too. They're still coming out, but let's go through them, Reuben.
Some people are going to get a sneak peek at the last few here.
Yeah, that's fun. But we have, what do we have up first here? Quarterbacks. So this is a top 10 quarterbacks in Eagles history. And I like that you went 10-1 in all these lists. You have to build up the suspense. So I'll keep it going for you here. I'll read the quarterbacks for you, Rube. At 10, you had Sonny Jurgensen, 9, Norm Van Brocklin, 8, Michael Vick, 7, Tommy Thompson, 6, Carson Wentz. Am I allowed to say it? 5, Jalen Hurts, 4, Ron Jaworski, 3, Randall Cunningham, 2, Nick Foles, and number 1, Donovan McNabb. Was this list difficult to come up with, Rube, especially the order of it?
Yeah, the 10 guys was pretty easy. The two challenges for me were where to put Carson, because he had such an odd career, and 1 and 2. Obviously, Nick and Donovan had to balance a decade of mostly success with the greatest short, brief run in history, in Eagles history. As far as Carson, what's crazy? There's only 4 quarterbacks in Eagles history that have won 35 games. That's not a big number, but that's the case. Donovan won 92, Jaws won 69, Randall 63, and Carson's next. He has the 4th most wins in Eagles history at 35. And I know quarterback wins isn't a perfect stat, but it gives you a sense of just how few elite quarterbacks this franchise has had over
just
the
longevity.
Years.
Like, you're going to win games if you're in a place a long time.
Exactly. And, Jurgensen is a Hall of Famer, but not for what he did here. Van Brocklin won a championship and then retired. So, Vic had an unbelievable year and then, it just didn't last. So, I was on WIP with, and Hugh, we went over the list, and Hugh Douglas said, "Where do you have Bobby Horn on that list?" His former teammate. I told him 117th, and he said I was a generous grader. But ultimately, I went with Carson 6th. I thought that was a good
this is the big point. This is what people are going to notice. You have Carson 6 and Jalen at 5. How much time did you think about that and whether or not Jalen will be ahead of Carson?
I figured Jalen had to be ahead of Carson just because of all things being equal. He's had success in the postseason, and Carson has 3 passing yards to Boston Scott in the postseason. Placing Jalen wasn't easy because he's got obviously a short period where he's been, but what he did last year and certainly the Super Bowl performance put him behind just 4, Nick and Donovan and Jaws and Randall. I mean, that's where he belongs. But I'll tell you what. If he gets to another Super Bowl this year, well, if he wins one, he's got to be number 1. If he wins the Super Bowl on top of the body of work, he goes to number 1. If he gets to another Super Bowl, we'll see. We'll see how the season is, but number 2 at worst.
Yeah.
So
I think you're right to have Donovan at 1, by the way.
yeah, and
I think shortly after the Super Bowl, I think you did say you had Foles ahead of him, but I think when you take a step back, you're like, look, we shouldn't underappreciate what Donovan did for a decade.
Yeah, I mean, Nick had he had the best day in Eagles history. But Donovan, and it's not just longevity. I mean, he won 9 playoff games, which is like 11th most in history, in NFL history. He got this team to 5 NFC Championship games with some help from other guys. AJ Feely won a few games that helped him get there, but he's got to be number 1 for body of work. I mean, he was a really good player. I think he turned off a lot of Eagles fans just because of he never acted like it never seemed like he wanted to be here. He never really embraced being an Eagle, being a Philly guy.
It's self-awareness. Like if you were doing like Madden, like the numbers, the rankings, like self-awareness would be pretty low.
Yeah. Yeah. But as far as Carson goes, I really you had to take into account what he did in 2017. They don't get the number 1 seed without him, I believe. So you
mentioned the help that Donovan had getting to some, obviously Nick had a lot of help in 2017 getting to that point.
I mean, he was 11-2, and that stretch was some of the best quarterback play we've ever seen by an Eagles quarterback for that, especially during that 9-game winning streak. I mean, he was as good as anyone we've ever seen. It's just he fell off a cliff. And 18 and 19 weren't bad years. He was up and down. He was inconsistent, but I think over those 2 years, he had 48 touchdowns and 14 interceptions. So he was still pretty good, although you could see him trending the wrong way. But as far as 1 and 2, it was just the body of work, and it was not an easy call. And you're right. I did write right after, maybe even the day after the Super Bowl, that Nick was the best. But in retrospect, when you take a step back, and we're now 6 years removed from that Super Bowl, Donovan's career was really good. And, for the 10 years he was a starter here, he had the 2nd most wins in the NFC behind Favre, 4th most touchdowns, 2nd most playoff wins behind Brady, 3rd most passing yards. From 2000 to 2004, he's probably the best quarterback in football. Won the most games, had the most yards. Brady wasn't really at his best yet. So I just thought body of work puts him at number 1.
Was there anyone you left off this list that was tough, or was it the 10
No,
there?
Yeah. It was tough finding. I mean, I got guys at the bottom of the list. I mean, Michael Vick had one chunk of one good year.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you look at the numbers. Michael Vick won 20 games as an Eagle quarterback. Only 7 guys have won more. And then you start looking at, I mean, only 11 have won more than 15 games. It's crazy. And only five, I believe, have won. How many have won a playoff game? I mean, it's you include like Tommy Thompson and only 2 guys since 1960 have made more than 1 Pro Bowl. And that would be Donovan and Randall. Now, Jalen's going to break all those records. What do you think Jalen will be at the end of this year? I think he's going to be number 1.
Possible. I'd say at least 3.
Because I feel like if he does enough to move up to number 3, he will probably have done enough to move up to number 1. Maybe. But he could go like 11-6. And
yeah.
Touchdowns come down a little. I mean, that's certainly possible. But I think he's going to be number 1. We'll see.
Okay. Yeah. We'll do it again next year. All right. We'll move on to running back.
Yeah.
You want to go through these guys?
Sure. 10 was Keith Byers, 9 Tom Wideshik. And again, it was tough filling out the bottom of this list. Timmy Brown is 8. Miles Sanders, number 7. Ricky Waters, 6. Deuce, 5. Then Wilbert, Steve Van Buren, Brian Westbrook, and Shady. The top 3 was tricky. Where to put Miles was tricky because, the numbers, I mean, he had 4 pretty good years. He's 7th in Eagles history in rushing, and he's number 1 by far in yards per carry, 5.0. But I also think of his career as being a little disappointing.
Second round pick.
Second round pick. There was no thought of extending him.
Same exact draft pick as Shady.
Yeah.
And Jalen.
Yeah. How about that?
It's weird.
So for me, the top three was really tricky.
Yeah, I don't envy you having to do that.
And I mean, the easy thing is to put Van Buren number one, Hall of Famer. He still has the franchise record in rushing touchdowns. Two things I took into consideration. He only had 4 years where he was an elite player. Like he only had 4 years where he had over, I think it was 600 yards. And over his last 4 years, he averaged under 4 yards a carry. He had a very short period as like an elite player. Now he was really, really elite, but he was also playing in a 10-team league. So
yeah, when you start like going era to era, it makes it really
hard.
tricky.
It's hard. Ultimately, and he made 5 All-Pro teams, but there was only 10 running backs to choose from. Westbrook so I went with him third, and it's tough to compare. But Westbrook and Sean and LaShawn are not contemporaries, but close to it. Shady got here the year after Westbrook, right? 2009.
Yeah.
Or when did Westbrook go to the 49ers? I got to look this up now. I didn't put it in the story. Westbrook's last year was 2009. So yeah, they were teammates 1 year, but Westbrook was hurt that year. Westbrook was a better postseason player. He had better success in the postseason. I went back and forth on this. Their numbers are kind of similar, but I just Shady's period as the best for a stretch. He was the best running back in football, and I just thought at his best he was the best running back I've ever seen, and it was for a good stretch. It was for a good number of years, and I'll tell you what, if it hadn't been for the Kiko Alonso trade, his numbers would have been. I mean, his first 3 years in Buffalo, he made the Pro Bowl every year, and was rushed for what, like 1,300 yards, 1,200 yards, and 900 yards. But from 2010 to 2014, he was the best running back in football, most touchdowns, a higher average than anyone but AP, and the receiving numbers were off the charts. I mean, he was catching 50 balls a year too. He did things no other running back has done. He's got the most fourth quarter touchdowns of 40 yards or more in history by like twice as many. And stuff like that. The only player in history with 11,000 rushing yards, over 500 catches, and an average of 4.5 or higher. Great receiver, unbelievable running back, runner, and did it for a long period of time at a position where most guys don't. So tough call. I could see taking Westbrook number one or Van Buren, but I went Shady.
Yeah, I'm okay with that, and I like that it's a tough decision. I think people who watch Westbrook up close realize how good he was, but I think he's probably underrated in fringe circles, right? I don't know if he gets the respect he probably deserves. That's
probably fair.
He was really good.
He was really, really good, and I mean his scrimmage yards. You look from 04 through 08. 1,500, 1,200, 1,900, 2,100, and 1,300 scrimmage yards. His receiving numbers were, I mean, he had 4 straight years with over 600 receiving yards as an Eagle. He was great. I think his period as an elite player was a little shorter than Shady's.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a tough one to break. That was one of the hardest ones.
Sure. All right, you want to move on to receivers?
Yeah.
I will read this one. I will give your caveat to the receiver one because it's an important one. You included the pre-wide receiver ends. So there are some names on here where, like, you're going to get some people who are saying, well, they weren't wide receivers, but for the purpose of this list, you included them. So I'll run through it. At 10, you had Jeremy Maclin, 9, T.O., 8, Bobby Walston, 7, Harold Jackson, 6, Deshaun Jackson, 5, Pete Pihos, 4, Pete Retzlaff, 3, Tommy McDonald, 2, Harold Carmichael, 1, Mike Quick.
Yeah, and I really did a lot of research into that end position before I decided to include those guys, because there weren't tight ends yet, but they were closer. Like, all those guys were averaging 16, 17 yards a carry. They really were closer to flankers and receivers than what we think of as tight ends now. I just thought there wasn't a category for them, but they were closer to wide receivers than tight ends, so I included them. And the funny thing about receivers is the Eagles have had so many guys with one great year. Like Maclin had one great year. T.O. obviously had one great year. You look at Harold Jackson led the NFL in receiving twice, but didn't do anything else. He was only here 4 years. And the other 2 years weren't big years for him. So Deshaun has actually been the most consistent receiver out of the group, and he could have been higher. The only Eagle in history with 6 straight 700-yard seasons.
Wow.
And he just, he showed up. And for a little guy, he was a gamer. Obviously, second most 50-yard touchdowns in history behind Rice. 38 touchdowns of 50 yards or more, including one last year. He's still doing it. As an Eagle, he averaged over almost 1,100 yards a season, highest in Eagles history. And his 68.5 yards per game is highest in Eagles history. So I might have devalued him a little, but then who do you take off? And this is another one where the top three, it really came down to the top three. Tommy McDonald, Hall of Famer. Harold Carmichael, Hall of Famer. Mike Quick, not a Hall of Famer. So why is Quick number one? I mean, Harold, and we all love Harold, but he was a little bit of an aggregator. He played a long time. He's very consistent. Still has a franchise record, 589 catches, 10 more than Zach Ertz had before he was traded to Arizona. But he's a guy, he didn't have a lot of big years. He had a lot of really good years. Deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. But when I look at Quick, for 5 years, he might have been one of the best Eagles I've ever seen at any position. And then the vet just tore up his knee so bad he couldn't play anymore. And he tried. But from 83 to 87, he was the best receiver in the league. 5 years, made 5 straight Pro Bowls, averaged 1,100 yards, 10.5 touchdowns, led the league in touchdowns during that span, 2-time All-Pro. To this day, he's one of only 3 players in history with 3 straight seasons with 60 catches, 1,000 yards, 9 or more touchdowns, and 17 yards per catch, along with Randy Moss and Lance Allworth. The only receiver in Eagles history named All-Pro more than once. And the eye test tells me Mike Quick. The eye test. And he also was playing with Jaws kind of at the end of his career and Randall at the beginning of his career. So he never had elite quarterback play. And he played on a really, really rough field that tore up his knees. I've never seen a receiver as good as Mike Quick. And if he played today on these surfaces, the way the game is now, I mean, he'd be Justin Jefferson. I really believe that. He's that good. So I went with him number one.
That's kind of like the arguments we always hear when it comes to Hall of Fame voters is like, longevity and this big body work versus peak play. And
yeah.
And it's always a fascinating discussion. Like, because sometimes like if you're just going by the eye test, then that peak play kind of wins out. It's like Terrell Davis, right? Incredible for a short period of time versus like Frank Gore, who's done it for forever.
Right.
Those arguments are always really fascinating to me.
Yeah, and a lot of these came down to that, and that was certainly one. I mean, Nick Foles versus Donovan. They just, how do you balance that out? I mean, Mike Quick was here when I started covering the team, and Devontae's the guy that reminds me of him the most. Just his ability to make just the body control, catches on the sideline, falling out of bounds. It's almost like you never saw Mike Quick make an easy catch. and it's the same with Devontae, and he's the best I've seen. And T.O. blocked me when I tweeted that, and I'm still blocked. I wonder if he'll block me on Threads. I'm on Threads, by the way. I saw you're on Threads.
Yeah, another thing.
Yeah,
Another
I actually tweeted for the first time, or I didn't tweet. I threaded.
You threaded.
Yeah. But anyway, that's the receiver list.
Real quick, AJ Brown, Devontae Smith. How many years, like 2022, do they need to crack this list?
1. Yeah.
And how quickly can they shoot up this list?
Yeah, because a lot of these guys have had 1 or 2 really good years. I mean, Devontae's now had 1 elite year and 1 pretty good year.
Mm-hmm.
AJ's had 1 elite year. 2 elite years gets you on the list and probably into the top 6.
Yeah. I don't know what T.O. is going to do, and these 2 guys bounce him out of the list.
T.O. played, I tell you what, it tells you how good T.O. was. He played, 21 games as an Eagle, including the Super Bowl, and he's top 10 receiver in Eagles history.
Yeah, it is pretty wild to be able to do it in that short of a time.
Imagine if he played 10 years here. So I just can't even
I know.
fathom it. What do you got next?
Defensive players. Do you want to read through this one?
Yeah, and this was tough because I didn't limit it to a position, but I wanted to make it all fit in a week. I mean, just some of the guys who didn't make the cut. Malcolm Jenkins didn't make the cut. Trent Cole, Willie T, Jerome Brown, Bill Bradley still has the Eagles record, tied for the Eagles record for interceptions. They didn't make it. Clyde Simmons didn't make it. But here are the guys that did. Number 10 was Trot. Number 9 was Troy Vincent. 8, Maxie Baughan, the great Maxie Baughan. Should be in the Hall of Fame. 7, Bill Berge. 6, Seth Joyner. 5, Fletch. 4, Eric Allen. 3, again, the top 3 just was like, how do you separate these guys? Reggie was 3. And originally I put Reggie as number 1. I just started looking at it. I was like, why should that be a given? I went Brian Dawkins, number 2, and number 1, Chuck Bednarik.
Okay, we'll go through this one because you're right. You start off the list, you go, well, Reggie's got to be number 1.
Yeah.
Right? He might be the best defensive player in NFL history. Why wasn't he?
He might be. Averaged 15 sacks a year while he was here. Had 25 more sacks than anyone during the period he was an Eagle. 2 things that, and I was looking for anything to break these 3 guys up. Eagles did not have postseason success while Reggie White was here. He was not an elite player in the postseason. He had that one safety on Bobby Hebert in '92 in the win in New Orleans, the wild card game. It's the only postseason game the Eagles won, and he was here 8 years. So, it's obviously it's not all because of Reggie White, but for a Hall of Famer and an all-time great, you look for him to carry the team in those games, and they were not a good defensive team in the postseason. So that was one thing, and it was just a shorter career than Doc and Bednarik had in Philly. He wanted to get out, and Dawkins wanted to stay. Bednarik played his whole career here. Any one of these guys could have been number 1. Doc played 13 years here. He played 5 more years than Reggie. Bednarik played
14
years here, which I think is still tied for the most, I believe.
Yeah. BG will tie it this year.
What's BG going into 14, right?
14, yeah.
Unbelievable. And BG's not on the list, but he'd be in the top 20 if I did 20. And we're comparing, a linebacker, a safety, and a defensive end.
Yeah.
We didn't call them edge rushers back then. But, tremendous postseason success while he was here. We know all the numbers. I mean, the numbers are off the charts. 37 interceptions, 21 sacks. I mean, a huge number of forced fumbles. I mean, he was just such a big-time clutch player and a big-time postseason player. 4 interceptions in the playoffs, including, obviously, the most notable one was in the 4th and 26 game, the punt by Brett Favre. That also returned 35 yards to set up that winning field goal by Akers.
People always forget about him, that like his ball skills, because everyone you remember him like laying big hits, but he covered the entire field. Like, it wasn't just he was laying people out. And it's like you'll see all the highlights now. And it's like, no, he could do everything.
One of only 2 players in history with 35 interceptions and 25 sacks. So yeah, that's a great point. Bednarik, 5 straight first-team All-Pros, 6 in all, 8 Pro Bowls, 20 interceptions as a linebacker playing in an area where they really didn't throw that much. And importantly, he started on 2 NFL championship teams, one as a rookie and one at the end of his career, near the end of his career. We know he played both ways. He only missed 2 games in his career. Nobody in Eagles history has made as many Pro Bowls. Nobody's made more All-Pro teams. Even though he played in 12-game seasons, he still played the 8th most games in Eagles history. But I love the interceptions. I love the durability, the championships. And he made one of the 2 biggest plays, along with BG, defensive plays in Eagles history, the stop of Jim Taylor in the 1960 championship game at Franklin Field. Tough to separate those 3 guys, but I think Bednarik, he checks every box. Postseason success, durability, long tenure, production, honors, championships, did it all.
Let me ask you a fun question. Obviously, Fletcher Cox is on the list.
Yeah.
Another player on the current Eagles with the best chance to eventually crack this list.
Oh, boy.
It's tough because, like, the older players who are the best players probably don't have enough time to do it. Like, Clay's been great, but he's probably not going to have enough time to do it. Like, could Reddick get there? He's only here on, like, will he sign another contract? Will he be as productive over the long haul? Okay. If Trent Cole's on the list, there's probably
not in the top 10.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe Slay, but he'd have to.
Slay's going to have the time.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe Sweat.
Sweat could have the time.
Maybe you might Sweat.
Have to, like,
Jalen Carter.
That's what I'm thinking. Like, you might have to go all the way to the rookie just to think about, like, having that long of a career to be able to do it.
Kayvon. I'm gonna go Sweaty.
Sweat, okay.
I'm gonna go Sweaty because Sweaty's still only, what is he, 26?
He's young, and I know the knee hasn't been an issue, but that's something in the back of my mind at all times with Sweat. Like, will he be able to have a really long career?
How old is Sweaty? He is. Yeah,
he
just turned 26.
Yeah, he was young.
And you look at his sack numbers, 0. He didn't play as a rookie. 0, 4, 6, 7.5, 11.
Yeah.
That number's going up every year.
Yeah. If he keeps doing it, like in year 10, he'll have 30.
Yeah, he'll hit BG's projected number. I'll go Sweaty.
I think
Sweaty's going to have a big year.
Okay, yeah, that's very possible. I think I'd have to go Jalen Carter. Yeah, which is like it's a wild projection, but like you're just trying to pick one guy who has a shot at it.
Yeah,
there aren't a ton of candidates.
It's a great question.
Yeah. All right, should we move on?
Yeah.
Next up, we have head coaches. So I'll run through the list here. 10, Rich Kotite. 9, Ray Rhodes. 8, Jim Trimble. 7, Buddy Ryan. 6, Nick Sirianni. 5, Buck Shaw. 4, Dick Vermeil. 3, Doug Peterson. 2, Andy Reid. 1, Greasy Neal.
Yeah.
I think people are going to be really surprised to see that if they haven't already.
To see Greasy up there?
Yeah, I think there's people just think Andy's the best coach in team history.
Well, look, I'll tell you what, the fact that I had to put Richie the K on here, that just killed me. But, there's only 8 coaches in history who've won a playoff game, which is nuts because this team's been around since 1933. All right. So we're in year 91. Only 5 have won more than one, including Nick Sirianni. Only Big Red and Doug have won more than 3. So Donovan over Foles because longevity and success over that brief moment. But the difference between the coach and the quarterback thing is that, like Andy versus Greasy Neal won 2 championships. And he took over a team that had never had success, reached 3 straight championship games, and in the 2 championship games the Eagles won, they didn't give up a point. They shut out back-to-back opponents, and the LA one was, after a long train ride. They go off the train in the middle of a field in Iowa and practiced. Is that incredible?
It is wild.
I think the game's changed a little bit. And the Eagles were bad. They'd been bad their whole history. So, in 46, they started to actually look like a real team. That was their first winning. Now, 45 was their first. Well, they were the Steagles there. He had to deal with all that. But, you look at 48 and 49, they were 23-1 in the regular season and won both NFL championships by shutout. I had to put them ahead of Big Red, just based on, like, if it was one, maybe not. And the crazy thing about Greasy Neal, you see that rookie on the Reds stole second, third, and home the other day? Yeah. He's the first Cincinnati Red since Greasy Neal to do that.
That's wild.
Greasy Neal was a baseball player. He played with the Phillies in 1920 and 21. And in 1921, Greasy Neal and Casey Stengel were teammates with the Phillies. They were both outfielders. And 27 years later, Greasy led the Eagles to the championship, and Casey led the Yankees to the championship, to the World Series, two months apart.
Wow.
Former teammates. And Greasy also, as he was playing baseball, coached William and Mary to the Rose Bowl. He was coaching college football and playing Major League Baseball. I mean, this guy did it all. Won 2 championships.
It's like a Forrest Gump life.
He's such a fascinating guy. I don't know if anyone's ever written a book. I'd love to write a book about Greasy Neal.
I'd read that. Jim Schwartz would read it.
I never played for the Orioles.
Jim would still like it.
Yeah, he'd probably read it. It would not sell well, but I've kind of come to terms with the fact that any book I write will not sell well.
That's freeing.
Yeah. Washington Jefferson, not William Emery. It was Washington Jefferson. Yeah. My bad. Coached at Marietta in the Ohio Athletic Conference. Big baseball school. I bet he coached baseball there. I bet he played baseball there. Anyway, I went. That's the direction I went. I felt good about that. Buck Shaw won one championship here in 60, but he was only here 3 years, only had the 2 winning seasons. So I had him just ahead of Nick. And Nick's Big Red second, Doug third, Vermeil fourth, and Buck Shaw. And then Nick, like how Nick's going to move up on this list if the Eagles make the playoffs. He'll move up past Buck Shaw, maybe past Vermeil. We'll see. It depends on how they do. Vermeil had a nice run, 4 straight playoff appearances, a team that hadn't been in the playoffs since 1960. Imagine that. What would they be saying on sports talk radio if the Eagles went from 61 to 76 without making the playoffs? I mean, imagine that.
It might hit apathy at some point.
77. And they made it 78, 79, 80, and 81. So Vermeil I thought did a great job here, but it'll be interesting to see how far Nick moves up.
Yeah. All right. We'll get to some other lists on the other side here. Catch all the sports action and more at Rivers Casino Philadelphia. Whether it's the money line or the pass line, there's something for everyone in a great sports book. Rivers Casino Philadelphia. Philly loves a winner. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
I want to see you come up with a list of my top 10 lists. Yeah. I'll expect that on the next pod.
Okay. Where should we go here next? Do you have a preference of which one we do next?
Let's start with the one I have on my screen is postseason surprises. So
okay, why don't you go ahead and break that one down?
This was a fun one. I really. So I did those 5 that we just did. I did a few weeks ago, and people were tweeting to me like, are you going to do any more? I was like, well, I got nothing else to do this summer, so I did 5 more. It was I don't know, more obscure topics, but just kind of different type topics. Postseason surprises, the players that surprised us the most in the playoffs, because it seems like with the Eagles, their history has been that their best players aren't the ones that make the biggest plays. Sometimes they are, but a lot of times it's like the last guy you expect. whether it's Corey Clement or whoever. So number 10 was Chris Warren, the running back. He only played 2 games as an Eagle, but one of them he ran for 88 yards in the wild card win over the Bucks. They just signed him at the end of the year, played 1 regular season game, and he was 20 for 75 in the second half of that game. Never played another game in his career. Rashard Cook had an interception and a sack in the Bears playoff game in 2001. Freddie Mitchell, 4th and 26. Heath Sherman, who his only 100-yard game that year was in the playoffs in 92 against the Saints. At the time, the only Eagles running backs with 100 yards in a playoff game were Steve Van Buren and Wilbur Montgomery. And since then, that list has been added to include Heath Sherman and Kenny Gainwell. So it's not exactly the list you'd expect. Damon Moore had that great 2001 postseason, 3 interceptions, 2 of them against Tampa. I got Kenny Gainwell on the list for the Giants game. Derek Burgess for what he did against Vic in the 2004 NFC Championship game. Burgess only had 2.5 sacks in the regular season that year and had 2 on Vic, and really did a great job containing him and keeping him from making plays with his feet, future teammates, and earned him a big contract with the Raiders and made 2 Pro Bowls. Ted Dean had that winning rushing touchdown in the 1960 NFL Championship game right down the street from here at Franklin Field. It was his only rushing touchdown of the year. He was a rookie. He didn't rush for a touchdown all year. Had the lowest rushing average in the league, 2.7, but he got the rock when it counted, and retired to focus on piano playing, musical theater, and teaching. When I interviewed him for the book for the greatest plays in Eagles history, all he wanted to talk about was piano. He found out I was a piano player, and we had a great conversation about musical theater and Guys and Dolls and Gypsy and all that. Number 2 is Rodney Peete for that. His incredible career performance in the 95 wildcard game against the Lions still has the record for highest passer rating in a playoff game. Nick did not catch him. Rodney Peete during the regular season threw 8 touchdowns and 14 interceptions. And in that game, he threw 3 touchdowns and no interceptions. The only time in his career he did that. And number 1's got to be Corey Clement. And that still remains one of the most amazing things to me. What he did in that game, never did anything before or after that would indicate. I mean, he was an okay receiver, averaged 5 receiving yards a game in his career. So had 100 in a Super Bowl, including really 2 of the biggest plays in the game, that touchdown in the back of the end zone in the second quarter with 3 guys around him, shifting the ball from one arm to the other as he stepped in bounds. Incredible play. I mean, receivers don't make that play. Like if Devontae makes that play, it's wow. That was a rookie undrafted running back making that play who caught like 7 balls all year. Yeah. And then that 55-yard catch and run that set up the Philly special just before halftime. Actually, the other one was in the third quarter, but that was at the end of the second quarter. And I'm sure I've told the story before, but Corey and I were joking at media day in St. Paul that week on that very cold day that I had an MVP vote. And I was like, yeah, if you have a huge game, maybe I'll vote for you for MVP. I almost did, but Nick kind of had that one locked up. Corey's never had more than 55 yards receiving any other game. 100 yards are the 3rd most in Super Bowl history by a running back, 4th most by a rookie, 6th most by an undrafted player, and 5th most by a non-starter.
Wow.
Talk about out of nowhere.
Yeah, that was the easy number 1, huh?
It was the easy number 1.
Yeah.
Yeah. The only other, the Rodney Peete game, it would have been a good number 1 on a normal team. But, even 4th and 26, you could have made a case for it. But Corey Clement, that was unanimous choice. All the voters had him number 1. Great guy, too. And a local guy from Glassboro.
Okay, I don't know if we need anything else on that one. That's fun, though. Yeah.
Yeah.
Want to move on to the next list here?
What do you got?
Top 10 comebacks?
Sure.
Okay, I'll go through these quickly, and then I'll let you kind of break it down a little bit. 10, you had Eagles at Jets, December 14th, 1996. Packers at Eagles, number 9, January 11th, 2004.
And that was that playoff game.
Yeah. Number 8, Eagles at Washington, October 7th, 1946.
Say it.
I won't. 7, Cowboys at Eagles, October 23rd.
I had a hard time getting to the locker room that day. It was, I don't
88. 6, you had Eagles at Browns in 91. 5, Eagles at Cardinals, October 25th, 59. 4, Eagles at Bills, October 27th, 1985. Eagles at Washington was number 3, September 17th, 1989. Eagles at Saints, January 3rd, 93. And then Eagles at Giants in 2010. That one we all remember pretty clearly. How do you even start to do a list like this?
The first thing I did was I wrote down the ones that I covered. Now, how many of these did I cover? I covered all of them. The ones I remembered, I think I covered 7 of them. But, Pro Football Reference has a page of biggest comebacks in every team's history and the biggest blown leads. It's a nice resource. So I took a look at that, and then I just looked at each game, like each comeback of 14 or more points. There's like 30 of them. I just looked like when they were that far back, how they came back. And also I took into account what it meant. Like a couple of these were bad teams, but the comeback was so crazy I included them. But most of these were in a playoff run or in a playoff game in a couple cases. And I took into account just how significant it was. We'll go through them all real quick. Eagles at Jets, they were down to their former coach, Rich Kotite, 20-7. That was a Jets team that went 3-13. But Ty Detmer led the Eagles back to a win. The Packers-Eagles game, we forget, we talked about the Brian Dawkins pick, 4th and 26. They were down 14-0 in that game. 2 Favre touchdowns to Robert Ferguson early. So that remains the 4th biggest comeback in playoff history, in NFL playoff history. Only 4 times the team has been down 14 points at the end of the first quarter and won. It just doesn't happen. This 1946 game I didn't know about. Eagles were down 24 at halftime. I looked up, I have that newspapers.com, and I looked up the game story, and it's hilarious. I mean, the guy's just ripping them. He probably didn't have time to rewrite his story. Eagles were down 24-0 at halftime and came back to win 30-24. One of only 3 games in history where a team down 24 at halftime has come back and won in regulation. The 88 game in Dallas, that was I covered that. It was my first year covering the Eagles, first full year. They were down 20-0 in the second quarter and came back and won. One of only 6 games the Eagles have won when trailing by 13 going into the fourth quarter. It's also the 3rd largest blown lead by the Cowboys in history. The 91 game was fun. The Eagles were down 23-0 in the second quarter. Randall was hurt that year. He was out the whole season. Bernie Kosar was having the game of his life. And Jim McMahon was so banged up he could barely walk. But somehow McMahon rallied the Eagles back. And I remember there was a huge play in that game. The Eagles forced a punt. The Eagles were trying to come back. Jeff Eagles punted. Webster Slaughter was their punt returner. Robert Drummond was a backup running back on the Eagles, who had been a pretty high pick. I think it was a 2 or 3 from Syracuse. And he stripped Webster Slaughter. Britt Hager recovered at like the 2-yard line. And McMahon threw the go-ahead touchdown to Calvin Williams. Eagles won 32-30. 3rd largest comeback in Eagles history. And the only road game in Eagles history that they've won after trailing by 16 after the first quarter. And that was on the road. That was 8 of these 10 are on the road, which is, I don't know what that means, but it's interesting. This is one I didn't know about. Eagles at the Cards in 59. For some reason, the game was played in Minneapolis, and I have no idea why. The newspaper articles didn't explain why. It just said at Metropolitan Stadium in Minneapolis. Didn't explain why.
Well, I didn't know someone was being reading it.
In 50 years, in 70 years. So Eagles were down 24-0 in the third quarter. Eagles scored the game's last 28 points. 2 Van Brocklin touchdowns to Tommy McDonald. One of only 2 games in history Eagles have trailed by 24 points at any point in the game. 85 game against the Bills, 17-0 in the third quarter. after the third quarter. They were down 17-0 after the third quarter, came back and won it. Mike Quick, game-winning touchdown. The only game in history Eagles have won after trailing by 17 points going into the fourth quarter. Now, they trailed by 21 points coming up in a second in the middle of the fourth quarter. The 89 game in Washington was crazy because that was at RFK, and Randall had just signed a contract extension the night before. Eagles were down 20-7 in the third quarter, and Randall rallied the Eagles back. And that game had the craziest ending where Gerald Riggs rushed for 221 yards in that game, but he fumbled. When Washington was trying to run out the clock. The fumble was forced by Seth, and Al Harris recovered, who went to Rancocas Valley, by the way, the other Al Harris. But he couldn't run, so he was looking around, and Wes Hopkins is yelling, "Give me the ball, Big Al, give me the ball." And Washington always maintained it was a backwards lateral, but it looked like he kind of handed him the ball, which is legal, even though he's in front of him. So it wasn't a backwards lateral. It wasn't a lateral. He kind of handed him the ball, which is legal. And Wes ran down to the 3-yard line, and then Randall threw the game-winning touchdown to Keith Jackson. That was an incredible ending, 42-37 game. And then Jerome forced a Mark Rippon sack on the last play of the game. Eagles Saints, we mentioned this game earlier. Their Eagles are down. This is a playoff game, wild card game in 92, down 20-7. The defense took over. Eagles scored 26 straight points in the fourth quarter. They outscored the Saints 26-0 in the fourth quarter. Eric Allen had a pick six. Reggie had that sack of Bobby Hebert in the fourth quarter. Randall threw a couple touchdowns. But number one has to be the Giants in 2010. And I've just never seen anything like it. The Eagles were down 21. They're down 31-10 with 7:28 left.
Yeah, it's insane.
Where were you watching? Do you remember where you were watching that game?
In our old CSN Philly newsroom. I was working the desk that day as an intern or like a part-timer.
Really? So you're in this building downstairs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, it was the thing I remember. So it was 31-0. Eli had just thrown his fourth touchdown of the game. The Giants fans are going crazy. On the Eagles' first play of the next drive, Vic threw a short pass to Selleck, who just ran down the middle of the field untouched. And I remember saying to whoever was next to me, like, the Giants look gassed. And it's like, I mean, there's not enough time to come back, but they looked totally, they weren't even pursuing Brent. That made it 31-17. Eagles onside kicked. Akers hit a beauty. Riley Cooper recovered it. Then Michael Vick ran 35 yards untouched, ran out of bounds. 4-yard keeper makes it 31-24, 5.5 minutes left. Giants punted with 3 minutes left. On the next drive, Michael Vick scrambled 33 yards and 22 yards. So in the last 7.5 minutes, he had runs of 35, 33, and 22 yards. And then he threw a 12-yard touchdown to Macklin with 76 seconds left to tie it. So now I'm sitting there thinking, well, they got all the momentum. They're going to win this in overtime. They just scored 21 straight points. The Giants look gassed. I think the Eagles are going to win it pretty easily in OT. Well, you know what happened next. Deshaun muffs the punt, Matt Dodge. Giants over pursue, and Deshaun prances through traffic and wins it. It doesn't go into the end zone until clock hits 0, which drove Big Red crazy. And listen to this. So it was 38. Back then you kicked the PAT, so they won at 38-31. Over the last 7.5 minutes, Eagles outscored the Giants 28-0 in 7.5 minutes. So at that pace, that's like a 200 points a game. They outgained them 215-23. And during that span, Michael Vick ran for 94 yards and a touchdown and threw for 121 yards and 2 touchdowns in 7.5 minutes. I remember I still don't believe it. And go ahead.
On the site back then, we'd have those big, bold headlines. And obviously we had to go with another miracle or, something like that when it ended the way it did. But until then, there was going to be Merry Vickmas because it was right before it was December 19th. So it was like everyone was gearing up for Christmas. And then Michael, it was unbelievable what he did.
Yeah. And excuse me, I remember we were in the interview room waiting for Deshaun, and he comes in. Obviously, there's like 200 people in there. He comes in. He's still got all his gear on. He's got his helmet on. He's got his pay. He just come off the field, and he goes to the podium and he says, "I'm really sorry, guys. I need a minute to process this." And he steps aside from the podium and he just stands there like with his hand on his face. He had taken his helmet off by then, and we're all just standing there waiting. And then he goes back to the podium and fills up the notebook. He was great. And I remember Jason Avant had a great block on whoever the Giants long snapper was. I wish I could remember who it was. He had a great block on that return. But I mean, 31-10 with 7:28 left it was spectacular. Now the next week, the Joe Webb game, we won't get into that.
Yeah,
but for 9 days, the Eagles were on top of the world.
All right, we have a few more lists here that we got to kind of get through.
All right, we'll go through these quick.
A little quicker. Assistant coaches, top 10 assistant coaches. I'll read the list with a little help on the pronunciation here coming up. 10, Juan Castillo.
It's Reich.
9 is
Dale Haupt.
8, Deuce Staley. 7, Frank Reich. 6, Sid Gilman. 5, Bud Carson. 4, Marion Campbell. 3, John Harbaugh. 2, Jim Johnson. 1, Jeff Stoutland. I get it. It was shocking, though, to see the 2 next to Jim Johnson's name.
I know. That was a tough call. I mean, the one thing here is Marion Campbell. He was such a bad head coach. He actually has the worst record in history by a head coach. But Eagles were number 1 defense when he was Dick Vermeil's D coordinator for that 7-year period. And he was terrific, but that was a tough call. I mean, Jim was such a great coach, but to me, what Stoutland means to this team, I don't know if I've ever seen. I think he's so much more than an O-line coach. I mean, he's running backs coach or running game coordinator, whatever. But I've never seen a coach have such an impact from the bottom of the franchise to the top, whether it's Jeff Lurie, the cook, defensive players, young guys, old guys. And Jim Johnson was he was revered by his players, and he was an innovative coach. I mean, they played 19 playoff games under him, or 17 playoff games under him. And they allowed 15.8 points a game, that's incredible. I think Stout's role in the Super Bowl year, the 17 year, the Super Bowl win. And then you look at, I mean, this is my favorite stat. In 50 years before he was he's an O-line coach, 50 years, they had 20 Pro Bowl offensive linemen. In 10 years under Stout, they've had 20 offensive linemen. And just how this franchise is built around the O-line and his impact on the team, I think is immeasurable. That was a tough call, but I went Stout.
Yeah, you can explain it, and it's tough. It's tough to see it, but because like for years you go, yeah, of course it's Jim Johnson, but
sure.
No, Stout deserves that respect now.
Yeah, and I mean Jim's one of my favorite guys. I miss him every day, but it's got to be Stout.
Yeah,
and two great guys, two just unbelievably great guys.
Sure, you want to go through your list of underrated, and we'll finish off with offensive linemen?
Yeah, we'll go underrated real quick. I'll just Ben Hawkins, 10, receiver, never got the credit he deserved, never played on a winning team. Guy Morris, just no Pro Bowls. Started the most games in Eagles history by a player never made a Pro Bowl. Sheldon Brown, played in Lito's shadow, but was just very consistent, very productive too. 3 pick sixes, 19 interceptions. Not as flashy as Lito, didn't jump routes, didn't make Pro Bowls, but really solid guy. Corral Buckhalter, I'll tell you what, doesn't get the credit because of he missed 3 full seasons in his career out of a 4-year span. But whenever he played, I mean, he was really good, really underrated receiver too. Averaged 10.5 yards a catch in his career. That's third highest in Eagles history by a running back. Randy Logan, really consistent safety, starter on the 80 team. Never made a Pro Bowl, never missed a game. Todd Harriman's one that you put in my mind a couple weeks ago. Played the most games under Andy Reid without making a Pro Bowl.
Wow.
Started 100 games as an Eagle. But it was just a really solid guy, whether he was playing tackle or guard. I was a big fan. I think saw him last year. He was at one of the games.
Oh, really?
Yeah, saw him down on the field before the game. Don Burrows is number 4 guy. I didn't really know much about. Yeah, he had 23 interceptions in a 3-year span, from 60 to 62. So that included the NFL championship game. He had 29 interceptions in 64 games as an Eagle. So that's like almost one every 2 games. Number 3, Willie T. One of only 2 players in NFL history with 25 interceptions and 35 sacks, along with Ray Lewis. Pretty good company. I don't think Willie T ever got the credit that the other guys on that defense got, just because he wasn't here till 91. He didn't play under Buddy, but he was really, really good, really productive linebacker. Number 2, Clyde Simmons, played in Reggie's shadow, but man, he was a great player in his own right. 121 sacks when he retired. He was 10th in history when he retired in sacks. And during that 4-year period from 89 to 92, which is really the heyday of that gangrene defense, he actually had the most sacks of any defensive end in the NFL. He had one more than Reggie during that 4-year period. And then had 50 sacks after he played with Reggie. So he wasn't just a product of playing across from Reggie. He was a great player. Number 1, I went Andy Harmon, who this is not a unanimous choice, but man, he didn't have a long career, but from 92 to 95, he and John Randall were the best defensive tackles in the league. He was great against the run. He had 39 and a half sacks during that period. So he's averaging 10 sacks a year as an interior lineman. Never made a Pro Bowl. Most sacks ever by an inside defensive lineman in a 4-year period without making a Pro Bowl at all during that span. Second still to this day in sacks among Eagles defensive tackles behind Fletch. And a great guy. It's a shame. He was another guy that the vet just tore up his knee so bad he just couldn't play. He was like 27, 28, and he had to retire. But really great, underrated player.
Any honorable mentions from that list? Guys that you thought about but didn't include?
There were quite a few. Brent Selleck.
Yeah.
Certainly. Never made a Pro Bowl, never had a 1,000-yard season, although, man, he was 3 yards short that 1 year. I think somebody mentioned Trent Cole. I think you can make a case. He's second in Eagles history in sacks now. And
people know that, right?
I don't know. I think he's a little underrated, but those are a couple of
underrated is so subjective too.
It is.
What does that mean? Who would you say is the most underrated player on this team right now?
Maybe Milton Williams.
Milton is a good one. I think I think even Josh Sweat is still underrated.
Could be. Yeah. For this, I was looking at guys a lot of these guys never played on winning teams.
Yeah, they got lost.
I think that's a big part of it. Now, nobody in recent Eagles history has not played on a winning team because they haven't had that many losing seasons. But yeah, I like that list. That was a good one.
All right, we'll finish it off here with your offensive line list. I'll read through it. Number 10, John Runyon. 9, Jerry Sizemore. 8, Stan Walters. 7, Brendan Brooks. 6, Bob Brown. 5, Trey Thomas. 4, Lane Johnson. 3, Jason Peters. 2, Al Wistert. Number 1, Jason Kelsey.
Yeah, this is it's funny because the Eagles had so many stretches where they just didn't have good offensive linemen. I was looking at it from like the 60s to Trey in 2000. They had two Pro Bowl offensive linemen in 40 years. So you look at this year, Landon Dickerson's a Pro Bowler, Kelsey got another one, Lane got one, Brandon Brooks got one, Evan Mathis back to. It wasn't always like that. I mean, this was a bad offensive line for good stretches of their existence. But most of these guys are recent. I mean, Size and Stan played together for a long time. Bob Brown was only here 5 years, but made 3 first team All Pros. Hall of Famer, just died a few weeks ago, sadly. But some of these guys are recent. JP, Lane, Trey. Al Wistert's the one people might not be super familiar with. Should be a Hall of Famer. 4-time first team All Pro. There were no Pro Bowls back when he played. At the end of his career, he made a couple. he's captain of 2 NFL championship teams. He taught high school at Riverside while he was playing. He was a coach at Riverside and a teacher. I think he was Bob Brookover's football coach. So I put him ahead of JP based on the team's success. JP only played in 1 postseason win, I think in Chicago, a double doink game. I think he tried to talk to him after that game about it. Right?
Yeah, well, my favorite thing about JP was that like he missed the entire playoff run before, but to him, he was like, I was on the team though. Like,
yeah.
I was a big part of it.
Yeah. And we forget, I mean, some people I think do forget how incredible JP was because he wasn't quite as good, it's kind of like the Fletcher thing. I think I just wrote about that. And you planted that seed in my head. It's an interesting dynamic. They're so good, but we're measuring them against that Hall of Fame level in their heyday, and they're not the same. So you kind of think they suck, and they don't. But Kelsey, if we did this a few years ago, it wouldn't have been Kelsey. But how do you not put him at the top?
Yeah, it's hard not to.
Lane
has a chance to still move up.
Yeah, and I think Lane is. I mean, he's in his prime now.
It's crazy because he shouldn't be, but he is.
Yeah, I mean, I thought he might have been as good last year, even playing with that injury in the postseason. Like you couldn't tell. I mean, between plays, you could tell. Like you could tell he was in discomfort, but during the play, you couldn't tell. He played really, really well. If he can stay healthy this year, he'll be an All-Pro again. I think he's now at the point where the things that were preventing him from getting recognition are gone.
Yeah.
And he can rack up some Pro Bowls and All-Pros and move up this list.
All right. That was it.
Something if Lane and Kelsey and JP all go into Hall of Fame?
Possible.
It is possible. I mean, Lane's still a long shot, but if he has 3 more big-time Pro Bowl type years, he's in the mix.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
All right. Any more lists on the way?
Oh, my top 10 Guided by Voices songs?
Okay, go ahead.
Let me see if I can find it in the next 15 seconds. Here we go. All right. Number 10, High in the Rain. That's recent from just a couple albums ago. It's not them. It couldn't be them. It is them. Number 9, My Impression Now from Fast Japanese Spin Cycle. Number 8, another recent song, Roosevelt's Marching Band from Tremblers and Goggles by Rank, released last year. Number 7, The Blondes. It's a song from a solo album called Off to Business, a Robert Pollard solo album. Number 6, I'm a Scientist from B1000. Number 5, Miles Under the Skin from another solo album, Coast to Coast Carpet of Love. Here we go. Number 4, Huffman Prairie Flying Fields from Half Smiles. That was the last album before the initial breakup with that lineup. Number 3, Storm Vibrations from Universal Truths and Cycles, which they played at the TLA in 2002. Number 2, Death of the Party by the Keane brothers, Tommy Keane and Robert Pollard from Blues and Boogie Shoes. Number 1 from B1000, Smothered and Hugs. I can do the whole 500 if you like.
All right.
Right.
Ben, you can cut that.
Guess
No,
what number
we're
500
good.
is.
All right. We good?
Number 5, yeah. If you want to know what number 500 is, tweet me. I'll tell you.
He'll give you the whole list. He'll read it to you.
Really small.
Yeah. All right. If you enjoy the Eagle Eye podcast, please rate, subscribe wherever you get your pods. If you're watching on YouTube, please click the like button, subscribe there as well. There's no one listening anymore. I don't know who I'm telling that to. That's it for Roob. I'm Dave. This has been Eagle Eye. We will talk to you soon.